Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to today's Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And I'm excited. I've been looking forward to this because we have a jam-packed program today talking about Texas politics, internet issues, as well as the history of Christian missions. We want to start out today talking with Senator Konni Burton from Texas. You know, Texas has become sort of a focal point out there for both our economic policies and our politics. People are fleeing California, moving to Texas. I was at giving a speech the other day at SMU with some other people, and they mentioned that the American dream hasn't gone away; it's just moved to Texas. And I agree with some of that. And joining us now to talk about some of the issues that are happening in Texas, Senator Konni Burton. She represents the 10th District in Texas. She ran for election 4 years ago, won that her first time in the Senate, and now she's running for re-election. She's a native of Texan. She starts out her bio saying Senator Konni Burton is a wife, mom, and lifelong Christian, and a native of Texas. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Merrill, for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
Well, you know, you and I was around at the time that you announced that you were going to be running for the Senate a little over 4 years ago. You were going to be challenging Senator Wendy Davis for that seat. And as much as we were hopeful, you know, the beating incumbents is sometimes difficult. And so we sort of thought at the time, yeah, that's good for you. Hope you do well. But yeah, you're going after an incumbent with a big name recognition and so forth. Shortly thereafter, Wendy Davis decided she wanted to run for governor, opening up that seat. So you didn't have an incumbent in there, and you took it on, and you won it. How have you liked being a senator?
Well, I tell you, the greatest part of it is that I do not have Wendy Davis as my state senator any longer. That's what I tell people. So I absolutely love it from that perspective. And I love it when I hear you tell that story that way, because that's true, right? It is very hard to compete against an incumbent with a name ID. I will tell you, as you've heard before, but I'll tell the rest of the listeners who are listening, I actually got into the race before she did her infamous filibuster on the Texas Senate floor. And which, of course, by the left standards and the media standards, propelled her into the national limelight. Of course, here in Texas, that didn't go over very well. It was a bipartisan bill that just took abortions, said that we would not allow abortions after 4 months. We just reduced it by 1 month. It was currently legal up into 5 months. We reduced it from 5 months to 4 months, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation that she decided she was going to filibuster and ultimately kill that legislation. And so that really helped me, you know, because I was already in that race, and it really helped me to gain name ID and propelled me out there. Then, of course, like you mentioned, she got out and went to run against the governor. But she did me a favor, and we, of course, ultimately passed that important piece of legislation. So happy that we did.
And the irony here is, as big a name and recognition as she had in the past, you now ask people, who's Wendy Davis? Whatever happened to her? And Konni Burton is an up-and-comer in the state legislature. You and Senator Don Huffines were sort of leading a charge in what was really a conservative state Senate. And it raises that question, typically when we look at Congress, the House can pass legislation, the Senate can't seem to do anything. But in this last legislative session in Texas, it seemed like the Senate could do anything and the House couldn't get anything done.
Exactly. Yes. And that has a lot to do with, I want to remind everybody, that has a lot to do with the fact that not only Senator Huffines, but Senator Bob Hall and all of our class, we came in with 8 of us, which is a very large class for the Senate. Many of us or several of us were new to the Senate. Some came in from the House, but we were a large class. And also we had a new Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and he was absolutely adamant that we change the rules of the Senate because what was happening is in the past we couldn't get conservative legislation passed because of the threshold that was in place. And so it was basically we'd have a Republican majority, but we couldn't get conservative legislation to the floor because of the threshold that was there. We needed 21 votes before we can even bring legislation to the floor. And with the lead of our new Lieutenant Governor, and with the support of the rest of the Senate, we changed that rule so that now we need 19 votes to get to the Senate floor. So that's a huge reason, and really the reason why we're able now to get good conservative legislation passed. I'll tell you, before I ran, I was an activist helping people get elected, and it was so aggravating to me to sit there and watch, a Republican majority not be able to get things done in the Senate just because of the rule that had been in place since the beginning, I guess, of the legislature. And so I commend our Lieutenant Governor for taking that on and getting that passed, and it has flipped. I hear it all the time from people, longtime legislators down in Austin, that say, my goodness, the House used to be the conservative body, and now it's not the case. It is the Senate that is.
And what is the environment like in the Senate? We look in Washington, and it just seems so toxic. Republicans and Democrats so antagonistic, can't do anything. Do you have a better working relationship with people on the other side in the Texas Senate?
Yes, absolutely. I tell people that all the time, that be glad that it is not D.C. in Austin, because it isn't. I can't speak for the House. I don't know what their personal relationships are, but I will tell you in the Senate, and granted, we're a very small body. There are only 31 state senators. So it's a small body to begin with. And then, of course, it is a different legislative body than the House, right? The House is just traditionally a more raucous body. They take care of their business on the House floors. They tend to be, more argumentative in public, whereas the Senate is much more of the, how do I say that? The polite body, right? And so we do a lot of our deliberations behind the scenes. Like I said, you have to get 19 members to support a piece of legislation before you can even get it to the floor, first of all. So we do a lot of our deliberations behind the scenes. But not only that, because we're such a small body, we have a little lounge right off of the Senate floor where we go and, get something to drink or something to eat, because we're on the floor for, many times beginning in the morning to late in the morning hours of AM morning hours the next day. And so we'll go to this lounge, and we're all in there together, Republicans and Democrats, of course, and we all know each other very, very well. We, ask each other how our families are doing, how our kids are doing. We certainly understand where each of us sits on issues, right? So many Democrats, including Republicans, definitely know what to ask me for support on and what not to ask me for support on, because they know where I stand on the issue.
Hold on there. We'll be back in just a minute with Senator Konni Burton.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Over the last few weeks, I have read editorials and heard comments that have used the phrase educational fraud. The reason is simple. We are spending more and more money on public education and have less and less to show for it. Last month was the release of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Many people call it the nation's report card. It is not a report card you would want to show to your parents. It isn't something American taxpayers want to see either. About a third of the nation's 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. Only 1/4 were proficient or better in math. We spend all of this time and money and still have a majority of students who cannot read or compute at their grade level. Dr. Walter Williams is a columnist and economist at George Mason University. Because he is African American, he also focuses some of his attention on black students. Sadly, they did even worse in these tests, 17% proficient in reading and 7% proficient in math. He asked an important question. Why are we giving these kids diplomas? The national high school graduation rate is over 80%. That means 2/3 of these graduates cannot read at the 12th grade level and 3/4 cannot compute at the 12th grade level. Not only is there fraud in high school diplomas, but also fraud continues when we look at the percentage of these students who go on to college. According to government statistics, about 70% of white high school graduates were enrolled in college, and 58% of black high school students were enrolled in college. This is also educational fraud, since so many of them are hardly college ready if they cannot read even at the high school level. Perhaps you can now see why so many of us are frustrated by what has become rampant educational fraud. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and we've got Senator Konni Burton, Texas Senator, on the line with us today, talking about issues developing in Texas. And you know, Senator Burton, you mentioned Wendy Davis and the abortion issue here a minute ago. Last week, President Trump came out with a announcement that, and I'm reading from the Washington Post headline here, a Trump administration will pull funds from groups that perform abortions or provide referrals. And it says the proposal would require a bright line of physical and financial separation between clinics that receive $260 million annually in federal funding. This is something that the Reagan administration had done. I believe Bill Clinton and maybe Barack Obama sort of pulled those back. Have you tracked this, and do you have a sense of how this might affect Texas and if it's good for Texas?
Yes, absolutely it would be good for Texas. My understanding is, so in 2013, the Obama administration stripped Title X funding from Texas, and due to our state's efforts to defund Planned Parenthood and the state women's health program, and so basically wanted to effectively bypassing the legislature. They directed the Texas Title X funds through a nonprofit that still currently administers those funds to abortion providers in our state. So I'm hopeful, and you may be able to help me better with this, but I'm hopeful that this will end this kind of funding scheme and put Texas back in control of these Title X funds. Is that your understanding that this is actually with the Title X funds, or is this a separate? Do you see this separately?
It wasn't clear to me from the president's announcement exactly what he wanted to do there, because the Reagan administration had some stricter rules. Those, I believe, were relaxed somewhat in what what President Trump wants to do. I know he's being challenged by this, and some groups are saying they will sue. But if you go back to something that's been a long-standing practice and just recently changed, I don't know how you have an argument that you can't do this.
Exactly. There's been a lot of that, actually, hasn't there? It seems like. So, we're just rolling back to how things were previous to the administration. So, yes, I mean, it seems on the surface to be something that would be very good for Texas. I certainly welcome it.
And this is important to you, because I believe you're on the board of the Gladney home, are you not? That's based in Fort Worth, and have what you call Gladney kids.
That's right, Gladney babies.
Tell us about that.
Yes. So I was on the auxiliary board, which is different than the actual Gladney Center board.
Mm-hmm.
That's the makeup of parents who are going to adopt or who have adopted, that kind of thing. And so, let's see, our daughters are now 26 and 21, so it's been very many years ago. But my husband and I adopted both of our girls from the Gladney Center, which is an adoption agency here in Fort Worth, which is really nationally renowned. Edna Gladney is kind of the first to venture into this adoption process, and so she's very well known, and this adoption agency is too. And so we were members of the board of the auxiliary. I had many roles in that, and worked very closely with them, with the birth mothers who came to Gladney, as well as outreach director for the auxiliary, and couldn't be prouder to be Gladney parents, and certainly proud of all the birth mothers who choose a loving option, which is adoption, and choosing a forever home for their babies. What's so worrisome is that, unfortunately, so much of the time that option is not one that is presented to these young ladies who are in a position and need somebody to show them all the options, and unfortunately they're not always all offered to them.
And what is the status of abortion today? Are there children for parents who are looking to adopt? Is there a long waiting line? What's the general status there?
That's a good question, because since I haven't been actually in that part of it for a while now, I can't tell you. I certainly knew when we were in that process, we knew from day to day, what the positions were. Like, for instance, when we were going through it, international adoption was actually just opening up.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how that's going, obviously there are more options for adoptive parents, but at the time, you had many, many more couples who wanted to adopt than there were infants, babies to adopt. Now, of course, you have other options other than babies as well. There's certainly older children and to adopt also. It just depends on what the families are looking for and that kind of a thing. But I know at the time there were many more families wanting to adopt than there were babies to adopt. And so that's really, really, a hard position to be in, knowing the numbers for abortions in our, not only state, but our country.
Texas has been pushing issues for a while nationally, but one of the things that we've been doing, and we've got a lot of pushback from, is the Texas voter ID law. I believe we changed it here fairly recently, and my understanding is last month a federal appeals court actually upheld the voter ID law, even though we were getting a lot of challenges on that.
Right, that is correct. So, let's see, I was just looking at this. We required the Secretary to establish a mobile voter ID program to aid in the processing and issuance of voter IDs. It also said that they couldn't charge a fee for any voter IDs,
mm-hmm.
which, is important, obviously. But we also created an exception to that ID requirement so that if they don't have an ID, the voter can complete what's called a declaration of reasonable impediment that demonstrates that they face a reasonable impediment to getting that ID. So it allows the person to still cast a ballot even without an ID if there are some reasonable impediments, which might be illness or lost or stolen ID, lack of transportation, those kinds of things. So we felt like it was, definitely a doable voter ID law, as did the courts, and so we were very pleased by that.
Just on your feeling, I mean, Texas and states, there's several states have passed voter ID laws, and they're habitually sort of attacked as being racist, attempts to try to stop minority voting, hinder Democratic votes, and things of that nature. In essence, just trying to disenfranchise people. Do you see any sense of that? I mean, were the Democrats in the Senate sort of generally opposed or generally supportive, saying
yes,
we do need something along this lines?
Oh no, I could. As my memory serves me, it's pretty straight down party line.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very surprising to me. I mean, listen, election integrity. My goodness gracious, they understand the importance of voting, and it's. I don't understand why they take the side that, this racist type of mentality of it. We want to make sure that everybody's vote counts. And so if there's any kind of election fraud going on, well, then that person's vote doesn't count, right? I mean, to me, it's amazing how we see it so differently and, frankly, very frustrating. That was definitely right down party lines.
Anything that we need to do to change that, tweak it, or do you think it's going to go forward and stand as is?
As far as I know, I think it's going to go forward and stand as is. I mean, obviously, I hear a lot about just more general comments about the integrity of mail-in ballots. We want to make sure, again, that people's identities aren't being stolen, that their votes aren't being stolen. And so, we'll be talking to people to make sure that process is as it should be. And if we do need to look into anything, it might be the mail-in ballots. But I don't have anything right now. We're just in the process of talking to people, making sure that process is full of integrity and, that kind of thing. So if we do move forward with anything, and I'm only speaking from our office perspective, I'm not talking about other legislators
Mm-hmm.
going to be doing something as well. But I do know that we have a lot of questions about mail-in ballots.
Our guest is Texas State Senator Konni Burton. If you'd like to talk to her, the number is 1-800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. We have a link to Senator Burton's Senate website on the Point of View website, so you can go to pointofview.net and you can find out more about her, and we will be back in just a minute.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And this is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. Welcome back to Point of View, where we're talking with Texas State Senator Konni Burton, who is just wrapping up her first 4-year term in the Senate, running for re-election. If you'd like to talk to her, ask her a question, make a comment, the phone lines are open, 1-800-351-1212. 800-351-1212. Senator, let's talk about two issues that Texas ought to be able to pass but can't seem to do it. One is property tax reform, and the other is educational choice. Let's start with the property tax. Governor Abbott tried to get property tax reform in there. I believe, if I remember right, didn't he call a special session in order to try to do that? But we cannot seem to address property tax reform. Now we've got the federal government got tax reform, and we can't seem to get anything done here in Texas.
That's when it is incredibly frustrating. When we can't get good, common sense, conservative legislation passed, and that was the case this past session. Just to kind of give people a little bit of history, again, as we mentioned earlier in the newscast here, the Senate seems to be the leading in conservative legislation, even though we have a lot, and I mean a lot of good conservative House reps in the House. Unfortunately, we had leadership this past session and the session before that didn't see eye to eye with conservatives on both of those issues, frankly. And so even try as we may, as we passed, during the special session, the Senate passed an excellent property tax reform legislation. I will tell you, though, the property tax reform legislation that the Senate passed during the special was not good at all, frankly. And so I want everybody to realize, while we have great Senate, sometimes we mess up too. And that piece of legislation was not good. The only thing I can think of is that we were just trying to get something passed, which that didn't even make it. But nonetheless, what was happening is many of our good House reps were trying just as hard as we were to get it passed in the House, but unfortunately leadership would get handpicked chair people to stall the legislation or, put it in a committee where it just would go to die. The problem lies in that this is ultimately, something that the local elected officials should be hearing more about from our citizens, because it is local elected officials who set these property tax rates. And but unfortunately, nothing is being done at the local level about these escalating property taxes. And so the state has rightly decided to step in and try to do something for the citizens, because local officials have not done anything yet. So yes, we tried to pass it. We passed a good piece of legislation in the regular session. It was killed by the House. Nothing got out of the House. We tried again during the special session, and the House once again killed the legislation. So we do. Oh, and I just want to quickly say that we will have a new Speaker of the House next session. The former House Speaker, who was one that did not see eye to eye with us on this legislation, is now gone, and so we are hopeful, very hopeful, that the House will elect a Speaker who will be open to these conservative reforms that, frankly, our citizens in Texas are clamoring for.
1-800-351-1212 if you want to talk to Senator Burton. And before we go to educational choice, let's go to Betty. She has an important question. Betty, you're on the air.
Well, I don't know how important it is, but I do have a question for Konni. Konni, thank you, first of all, for your service to our great state of Texas. And one of the things that I've been reading recently about is your position on lobbyists, and specifically those that are paid for by taxpayer dollars. And I was just wondering what you thought about the chances of that, because I understand there was a bill that was enacted, and what are the chances of getting that type of lobbyist reform happening in the state of Texas, which I think is very much needed?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm hopeful. I will tell you, so my first session there, I had a bill that said no more taxpayer-funded lobbyists, just a straight-out bill We should not allow this to happen. And if I may, to give others a little bit of background on
Yes, I think we need a little background on it.
Thank you. So we have lobbyists down in Austin, that are there to help us to understand different industries, different businesses, different companies. That's important. The legislators who are elected cannot know everything about everything, right? We don't want to. We want to get educated by our citizens, by those that represent companies and businesses. However, we also have lobbyists. What has developed over time is our taxing units, which are, say, schools, counties, cities, have decided to hire lobbyists as well. My understanding is once upon a time, there were organizations that helped these taxing units by saying, okay, these are the pieces of legislation that could affect y'all. This is what it does. And so the elected officials would call, those of us in the legislature and talk to us about it. Well, over time, they have developed a lobbying arm. And so now these taxing units pay these lobbyists to go down to Austin and lobby for or against legislation. Well, for instance, on this very important issue of property tax reform, where every citizen I know of calls me and says, please, I need my property taxes lowered. Mm-hmm. Well, cities, counties, schools are paying lobbyists to go down there to keep any property tax reform from getting passed. Well, you know who pays these lobbyists? The taxpayers. Right. So our money is going to these taxing units. The taxing units are using this money to pay lobbyists to go down to Austin to lobby against our wishes. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. You should care about this. And frankly, it was a bipartisan effort on my side of this. So the first year I had to let's get rid of it altogether, and that was just like it came out of the blue. Legislators down there didn't understand it. It's like, what are you talking about? So this past session, I just had a disclosure bill to try to pass it. At least had the taxing units have to say how much money they're spending on this, because right now it comes from the lobbyist. The lobbyist has to disclose it, but the taxing unit does not. And so I was at least trying to get that passed, and I had Democrats and Republicans come on board. It's like, well, of course, this makes sense. Still couldn't get that to pass. I will tell you, with this past session, as frustrated as we were with these lobbyists who were down there lobbying against the individual taxpayer, particularly on property tax reform, I bet a majority of the Senate began to realize toward the end of the session how important my legislation was. I had many of them coming to me and saying, okay, I get it now. I see what's happening. I understand that the taxpayer dollars are being used against them. And so I'm actually hopeful after this last session that we can get something done in the next session, actually, because they're getting it, how bad this is against the individual taxpayer. And I appreciate so much you bring that up, because I think it's very important. And taxpayers, when they hear about it, they're outraged. The thing is, they just haven't known about it in the past.
In the minute or so that we have left, do I recall that some senators won't see taxpayer-funded lobbyists in their office?
That would be me. I'm the only one. I'm the only one that I know of. Now, there may be others, but I'm the only one that I know of. If I said, no, I'm not going to see you, I will talk to the elected official. They can pick up the phone. That's what we are elected to do, to talk to each other about this kind of thing. I'm not going to see a taxpayer-funded lobbyist. I'm refused to do that. So, yes.
And nobody else has picked up on that, but they may next session, you think?
That's right. Like I said, I've got a lot of people in support of it. Since the very end of the session, they were saying, okay, Konni, we get it. We need to get this passed. This is important because we're just fighting our own taxpayers, and it's a ridiculous situation that we've gotten into. We need to get back to where it's just an advocacy arm, not a lobbying arm.
1-800-351-1212 if you want to talk to Senator Konni Burton. And when we come back, we'll talk about why Texas can't seem to pass educational choice. We'll be back in a minute.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Our national motto has appeared on our paper currency since the 1950s, our coins since the 1860s, and was first articulated as our motto by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. Recently in Ohio, a group of atheists filed a lawsuit against the United States Congress, the Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Mint, the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and, for good measure, the United States of America, in a failed bid to invalidate the national motto from our currency. First Liberty Institute represented the American Legion in a friend of the court brief urging the court to dismiss the challenge to the motto. Thankfully, the court has joined 11 circuit courts of appeal and the Supreme Court of the United States in rejecting constitutional challenges to our national motto. If a court were ever to invalidate the national motto, "In God We Trust" would have to be scrubbed from the walls of Congress, erased from our currency, deleted as the state motto of Florida, cut off with a flag of Georgia, ripped off the backs of sheriff's cruisers nationwide, and bleeped during the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Not only would that come at an enormous cost to accomplish, it would come at a detrimental cost to our history and heritage as a people. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and we have with us Texas State Senator Konni Burton. Connie, this just puzzles me. One of the longest principles among conservatives has been to give people the ability to be able to opt out of the public education system, go to private school, go to a charter school or something of that nature, some type of educational choice. Lots of states have done something. Texas, one of the most conservative states, can't seem to do anything on this. Why not?
Yes. Well, again, not only is it probably a difference between the Senate and the former makeup of the House on this. Actually, we have a problem between even Republicans, those that represent rural areas and those who represent urban areas. So it's not only a difference between the two branches of the legislature, but there's also some problems within the Republicans as well. I don't understand it either, frankly. My dad was a public school principal and superintendent. I grew up went to public schools. Our girls, mine and my husband's girls went to public schools. He went to public school. You know, we are advocates of public school. I also believe that the state should focus on its core functions, which is education. And education is, the number one expenditure in our budget, as it should be. I also believe, however, that we represent people. We don't represent institutions, which I think I see this a lot now. It's a kind of interesting mentality that I see with a lot of legislators. Listen, we certainly have dialogue with those representing public education. We have dialogue with all of our elected officials at the city and county, and that is those levels. But ultimately, I represent people. I don't represent those institutions, right? So when I have people in my district that would rather, for whatever reason, and it really, frankly, isn't anyone's business but theirs, that family's, if that particular public school isn't right for their child for whatever reason, and goodness gracious, why? I mean, there could be many reasons. We all know, children are very, very different. They learn differently. They need different environments. We could go on and on. When they are looking for something different for their child in education, there's no reason why we shouldn't allow them to seek something different. And so the educational choice bills that we've had, which I was kind of on this kind of education consortium back when I was an activist and not even elected official yet, and it was very similar to what became a bill once I was elected. I really liked it. I thought it was the answer to it all. Is that, some of the money, and there's a lot more to it than this, but ultimately some of the money actually stays with the public school, a portion of the dollars. So they're not, for that student that decides to go somewhere else, a portion of those dollars actually stays with that public school. So they're actually getting money for a student that's not there, but a portion of them, say, 80% of it follows the student somewhere else. And I thought that was the best answer because, the school is still getting money. It's getting money for students that's not there. And yet they're giving, a choice to that family that needs a different educational option for them. But boy, howdy, it was quite an uphill battle. And as you know, we couldn't get anything past both sessions. So again, a big hurdle for us was former leadership in the House. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there's not still hurdles to overcome in the House and the Senate, but I'm hoping that this next session will be easier with new House leadership. Again, I want people to think in terms of parents and what parents are the ones who know best what their child needs. And when they're needing something different, I don't think there's any reason not to offer them in the state of Texas.
Yeah, I both of my girls went to public schools, and I would argue that some people get very good educations in the public school system, but some don't. And it seems like those who don't should have an option to be able to try something else, especially if they're lower income and don't have the money to be able to move to a different district, as some people have. In our closing minutes here, let me ask you this. Democrats and the left are just salivating over the notion that they think Texas is just on the verge of turning purple and maybe even blue sometime here in the near future. And as I look at the state Senate, the state House, we're not getting more liberal, we're getting more conservative. It's becoming the most conservative legislature arguably in the country. Why do you see Texas changing in that regard? Do you think we're going to be in 5 years or 10 years a reliably blue state?
No, I don't. Now, I say that very confidently, but I also say, know that we have to stay ever vigilant, right? you're exactly right. Again, before I was elected, I worked very hard to get good conservatives elected, because those of us that stand for what Republican values are, and that is limited government, personal liberty, free market, we were very frustrated that we weren't getting that kind of legislation passed. And so Texans have been frustrated for quite a number of years, and it's part of why, we got Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick elected, because he was going to, change that very important Senate rule that I told you is able to get us to pass good conservative legislation in the Senate. The Senate has only gotten more conservative. We've got conservatives primarying more moderate Republicans, right? So I see us as staying a very conservative state. People are moving in now. People are moving in from California because they see that Texas is the area to come for job creation, for growth, for more personal liberty. It's certainly we've got those that are coming in that we worry about too, right?
Senator, let's take we've got a quick question on education from Aaron. So let's see if we can get it in the last minute and a half or so. Aaron, you're on the air.
Hi there. Hi, Senator Burton. My name is Erin, and I'm looking at creative homeschooling and private school options for my young children. But I admit I have a lot of friends who are public school teachers in Texas, and they're convinced that if we let education choice happen, it'll hinder the public school system, the model. It'll make the teachers' jobs harder. Now, I don't understand why they think that, other than the public school unions have made this argument and they've bought into it. Can you shed some light on what's the truth and what are just propaganda?
Right. So they think, you're saying that they think that having choice is going to make their job harder. Is that my understanding of what you're saying?
Yes, I think so. And we've only got about 30 seconds left.
Sorry. Yes, I haven't actually heard that particular argument. I don't know what would make it harder. To me, just giving choice to parents who need that choice is only going to give everybody the opportunities that they need and should have here in Texas. So I'm afraid I can't answer that because I'm not really sure I agree with that.
Thank you, Senator Burton, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. Welcome to joining Point of View. Today we're going to turn our subject to the Internet. A number of things are happening on this in Congress as Democrats and Republicans battle over the way the Internet works, how that works, what's going to happen with it, and the future of the Internet. Joining me is Tom Giovanetti. He's president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, a Dallas-based think tank that's been around for 30 years now. Tom is an expert on this issue. He's been writing about it, and you can go, talking about the Internet, to pointofview.net. We have Tom's bio up there, plus we have a couple of recent articles that he has published about what's been happening in Congress. Democrats tried to move legislation last week on the Internet in the Senate, trying to re-regulate that thing. Tom, thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, bring us up to speed here. Now, what was it that that Democrats were pushing with Republican help through the Senate last week?
Well, it does require a little bit, I think, of explanation and history to understand what happened last week. We've been talking about, the Internet itself is only a little over 20 years old as far as in general circulation, so it's a relatively new thing. And for about the last 10 of those 20 years, we've been talking about something called net neutrality. And what proponents of net neutrality have wanted is government regulations to protect what they view as their freedom of access to the Internet. Now, generally speaking, most folks like me, most conservatives and most free market folks are not big proponents of government regulation. We think most of the time putting the government in charge of things is actually not a great idea. So, we over time have been opposed to the idea of heavy regulation of the Internet. But regardless of whether or not you're sort of pro-regulation or anti-regulation, it's fairly obvious that the Internet over the last 20 years has gone from nothing to a extremely vital and dynamic and innovative place, and it's done all of that without government regulation. So whatever one wants to argue, one cannot argue that government regulation was necessary for the Internet to thrive because, as I said, obviously it has thrived just fine without regulation. In the last year, go ahead.
Go ahead.
In the last year of the Obama administration, however, the Obama administration forced through a really heavy set of regulations on the Internet called Title II. And the Title II regulations are literally the same regulations that were written in the 1930s to govern the old AT&T telephone monopoly. So they're old, out-of-date regulations that are not even up-to-date for telephone systems anymore, much less for the Internet. But the Obama administration, because they just believe in regulation, because they're very pro-government, pro-regulation, they placed these heavy, outdated regulations on the Internet as I said, in the very last year or so of the Obama administration. So one of the Republican commitments was to overturn this. That was a commitment that President Trump made during his campaign. It was in the Republican Party platform that if Republicans won, they were going to overturn those regulations. And so sure enough, Republicans overturned those regulations early last year.
And to be clear, this is mostly being done through the Federal Communications Commission. I mean, this was not legislation that the Obama administration pushed through. It was done through agencies, right?
Yes, that's exactly right, and I appreciate that clarification. The Obama FCC, the Obama Federal Communications Commission, pushed these heavy regulations, and then when Republicans took control, President Obama appointed a Republican to be in charge of the FCC.
You mean President Trump?
And so President Trump, that's right, I'm sorry, President Trump appointed President Obama would not have appointed a Republican to be in charge of the FCC. So President Trump appointed a new head of the FCC, and that FCC overturned the previous Obama FCC's regulation. So right now, we are back under the same light touch regulatory structure on the Internet that it has always had from the very beginning. So the Obama regulations were a very short period of time, just about 18 months that they were in effect.
And only part of them actually went into effect, didn't they? I mean, it wasn't the whole thing.
That's right. Well, it takes time for government to implement new regulations, and they frankly just hadn't gotten around to beginning to enforce them. So in the history of the Internet, there was this very brief blip during the last year or so of President Obama where the Internet had heavy regulations, and that's all. And now that's over, and now we're back to sort of the default condition, the default light touch regulations that the Internet has virtually always had.
Now, the way the Democrats are doing this, they're taking an unusual technique in order to try to re-implement these regulations. How is that working?
Yeah, this is actually it would be funny if it weren't so harmful. The Democrats, of course, wanted to go back to their heavy regulations, and the Democrats are opposed to everything that the Trump administration wants to do. So they were angry when the Trump administration threw out these regulations. But Republicans reminded them that there is this amazing tool that Congress has called a CRA. And a CRA is essentially a way that Congress can review regulations and can throw them out. Now, that's a good thing. This was actually part of the contract with America back in 1995 when Republicans first took control of Congress. One of the first things they did was they passed this Congressional Review Act, or CRA. And what the Congressional Review Act does is it gives Congress sort of a streamlined opportunity to throw out regulations that they don't like. And that's a good thing because it should be Congress that's in charge, not the regulators. So all of those of us who are good and right-thinking people, we all like the CRA process. We like the Congressional Review Act. Well, what the Democrats have attempted to do and what they are attempting to do is use this Congressional Review Act to overturn the Trump FCC's recent throwing out of these regulations. Now, that's a tongue tangler right there. What they're doing is they're trying to use the Congressional Review Act to reimpose regulations.
As opposed to remove regulations.
That's exactly right. So the whole idea of the Congressional Review Act is to overturn regulations. And what the Democrats are trying to use is use the Congressional Review Act to reimpose regulations. So they're using it completely contrary to its intention. They're using it completely contrary to what we call legislative intent, which is the language in a bill that Congress puts in a bill to explain why they're doing something. And it's a ridiculous thing to do. It's contrary to the spirit of the CRA. It makes no economic sense. It makes no sense from a technology policy standpoint. Unfortunately, none of that stopped the Senate last week from agreeing to it. And so last week, a very harmful thing happened in the U.S. Senate, and that is that all the Democrats and 3 of the Republicans voted to reimpose regulation on the Internet.
And when we come back, we're going to see how that, what those prospects might be in the House. My guest, Tom Giovanetti with the Institute for Policy Innovation, talking about the Internet. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Over the last few weeks, I have read editorials and heard comments that have used the phrase educational fraud. The reason is simple. We are spending more and more money on public education and have less and less to show for it. Last month was the release of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Many people call it the nation's report card. It is not a report card you would want to show to your parents. It isn't something American taxpayers want to see either. About a third of the nation's 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. Only 1/4 were proficient or better in math. We spend all of this time and money and still have a majority of students who cannot read or compute at their grade level. Dr. Walter Williams is a columnist and economist at George Mason University. Because he is African American, he also focuses some of his attention on black students. Sadly, they did even worse in these tests, 17% proficient in reading and 7% proficient in math. He asked an important question. Why are we giving these kids diplomas? The national high school graduation rate is over 80%. That means 2/3 of these graduates cannot read at the 12th grade level, and 3/4 cannot compute at the 12th grade level. Not only is there fraud in high school diplomas, but also fraud continues when we look at the percentage of these students who go on to college. According to government statistics, about 70% of white high school graduates were enrolled in college, and 58% of black high school students were enrolled in college. This is also educational fraud, since so many of them are hardly college ready if they cannot read even at the high school level. Perhaps you can now see why so many of us are frustrated by what has become rampant educational fraud. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And you're back with Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. My guest today, Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, and we're talking about the internet and internet regulation. So, Tom, before we went to the break, we went through the issue of Democrats wanting to re-regulate the internet like they did at the end of the Obama administration. They've using a unusual tool called the Congressional Review Act to do that. Democrats in the Senate were able to convince a few Republicans to come on board with them, and so I believe that passed. What are the prospects of that in the House?
It did pass the Senate, unfortunately. It's stunning to me that, Republicans always run against regulation. They always run against big government. So it's stunning to me that in a Republican-controlled Senate, 3 Republican senators joined all the Democrats to vote to reimpose regulation on the Internet. It's just it's just one of those things that's just amazing. If any one of those 3 Republican senators had done their research, they would have understood that that was the wrong way to vote and a poorly chosen vote. So in our system, of course, it takes both houses of Congress to agree. And so now proponents of this CRA to re-regulate the Internet will move to the House of Representatives. That's less likely to pass the House of Representatives. They would have to persuade, over 20 Republicans to vote in favor of it. So it's less likely, but so that gives folks like me a little bit of relief from our anxiety about it passing. On the other hand, you never know. I mean, if you can get a Republican Senate to pass it, maybe they are able to twist the arms of enough Republicans to vote for it. The problem on this issue is that there's so much ignorance and misunderstanding of the actual issue. And so there may be Republicans in the House who would vote for this regulation thinking somehow that it would have something to do with, say, Facebook or Twitter, discriminating against conservatives or something like that. But it doesn't do any of those things. It really has nothing to do with those things. It really has to do purely with putting economic regulation on ISPs. ISPs are the people that you buy your internet from, whether it's a phone company or a cable company or a wireless company. And the re-regulation of the internet gives a free pass to companies like Twitter and Facebook. They're not covered by that regulation at all. So there's a lot of conservatives out there right now who are frustrated at some of these internet companies, and there might be a temptation to say, yeah, let's let the government regulate them. But this process that's going on right now in Congress would not regulate those companies like Facebook and Twitter. It would only regulate the ISPs, the cable companies and the phone companies. And one of the things that happens when you put additional regulations on those kinds of companies is that they now have to comply with those regulations. That's why regulations drive up costs. The regulating of your internet companies that you get your internet from will not make your internet cheaper. It will likely make it more expensive. And if you happen to be one of those folks that lives out in a rural area, you don't have access to high-speed internet yet, you're hoping a cable company or a phone company will dig a trench or run a line to your neighborhood so that you get high-speed internet, the likelihood of that happening declines if these companies are now having to face heavy regulation. We know that during the year or so when those regulations were in place under the Obama administration, that internet companies decreased their investment in infrastructure. They stopped building out new networks. They stopped going out into new areas because of the high cost of the regulation.
Okay, well, let me just ask this question. If the Democrats are successful and if they're in the House and Senate and they're able to get President Trump to sign it, what would I see change if you're bringing these regulations back on the internet? How would that be different? My sense is that a lot of young people, millennials and so forth, just sort of, the internet's always been there for them, and they sort of think it's just there, and so what's the issue? It's there. It's always been there for me. Why would it make a difference? So what would I see happen differently if these regulations are brought back in?
So many times the problem with government regulation is not the effect you see. It's not what happens. It's what won't happen, or it's what doesn't happen. Because you're correct. If somehow the Democrats succeed in reimposing this regulation on the internet, if President Trump gets persuaded to sign it, it's not like the internet will go away. It's not like your connection will suddenly slow down. That's not what will happen. But what will happen is that these companies that have been pouring literally billions of dollars a year into investment will slow down and decrease that investment. So new things that would happen in the future will either not happen or it will take a longer time for it to happen. There's an argument that if the phone companies had been sort of deregulated and broken up, 10 or 20 years earlier than they were, the internet would have come along 10 or 20 years sooner than it did. But that was delayed because of the monopoly era, because of regulation, that sort of a thing. So when companies don't invest, when they don't take risks, there's new products and new services and new infrastructure that simply does not get built. And that's why I made the comment I made earlier about, for instance, people who live in rural areas, people who don't have adequate connections, or people who are hoping to get higher speeds. If you're a customer of a cable company over the last 8 or 10 years, you are accustomed to just regular, every couple of years, increases in your internet speed, and many times the prices have either stayed the same or gone down while your speed increased. And that's what's called innovation. That's what innovation looks like in the internet world, is faster speeds at lower costs. That happens because those companies take risks and innovate, and they will do less of that if they are heavily regulated. So it's not so much the changes you immediately will see, it's the changes that you won't see that you would have seen.
The net neutrality people will argue that these internet service providers, the Verizons, the cable networks and so forth, that they wanted to try to preference some internet traffic over others, and so therefore it would not all be treated equally or neutrally. What was the point of that? What were they trying to get at there?
You know, as we said earlier, this whole net neutrality argument has been going on for about 10 years. And when the net neutrality issue first came up, our internet speeds were a lot slower than they are right now. I mean, the average person's internet speed right now, they have enough speed that they can do anything they want to, and they don't even notice any kind of slowdowns or delays. That was not true 10 or 12 years ago when the net neutrality debate first came up. And so what net neutrality was all about was the idea that companies might charge certain people for certain providers for faster speed or for better access. And that matters in a world where the bandwidth that is available to people is really, really limited. What's happened over the last 10 years is that there's so much more bandwidth now, and the average person has a much higher speed internet connection right now. So there's a sense in which a lot of that has simply gone away, the idea of preferencing certain providers with higher speed or lower speed. So the net neutrality issue has changed over the years. What the net neutrality issue is today is this issue of whether or not certain content might be blocked. And I hate to be so critical of this, but this is almost a delusional concern that people have. The idea that your internet company would purposely block access to content for its customers is kind of crazy. In a free market, the way corporations make money is they please their customers. They do more for their customers. They try to give their customers products and services that their customers want. You don't make money in a free market as a business by harming your customers, by taking things away from your customers. So the idea that there's some threat out there of internet companies blocking people's access to lawful content, I think is just crazy. But you'll hear this concern expressed by net neutrality activists. And what it really comes down to is behind all of this campaign for net neutrality, you find two things. You find hardcore left-wing activists who just simply don't trust the private sector. They don't trust the free market. And what they want is government to be in control of the internet. They want the internet to be a government-regulated utility. The most extreme of them want the government to take over control of the internet. They want the government to nationalize the internet and basically just give it away to everybody for free. Because if you're a lefty, you think that's how things work. You think that government can just deliver free products and services to everybody somehow because government has this magical ability to do so. If it had been the government's job to roll out the internet to everybody starting 20 years ago, I can assure you we would not have it as good as we have it today.
We would not. This is Merrill Matthews. You're on Point of View. If you want to talk to Tom Giovanetti about the internet, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back in a minute. More discussion with internet regulation.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team. or call 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. On the line with me today is Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. You can find out more about IPI by going to IPI.org, or you can go to the Point of View website, pointofview.net. We have Tom's bio up there, plus a couple of pieces that he wrote recently about internet regulation and what's been happening in the Senate and may happen in the House. Tom, we closed off the last segment talking about the what they're really trying to achieve with the net neutrality and the re-regulation of the internet. But the irony here is, it seems to me, as you were pointing out, it's not the internet service providers where we get our internet service that would be cutting off or limiting speech, information, and so forth. That actually tends to be more the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, and Snapchats. I mean, we've been hearing about them not putting up certain types of information or censoring certain information, maybe for good, maybe for bad. But they're the ones that have really been the ones that are that affect the information we have access to, and they're not even affected by this legislation, as I understand it.
No, you're correct, and I think this is an important topic for your listeners to have a better understanding of, because there is a lot of discontent right now among a lot of folks about some of the things that are going on the Internet. There's a lot of discontent about the way some of these companies market to us, the way they use and abuse our privacy or violate our privacy, the way sometimes the political opinions or the political worldviews of companies like Twitter and Facebook end up discriminating against conservatives or Republicans or against Christians. People can express a very traditional religious sentiment on Twitter or Facebook and find it blocked, find their account shut down. There's a lot of people that are very unhappy about some of the things like that are going on, and I think there's some important discussions that we need to have about how those policies work and is there a role for the government. But what people need to understand is that the internet regulation debate that's going on right now that you and I are talking about has nothing to do with any of that. It won't affect that at all. In fact, for some bizarre reason, it specifically focuses on only one segment of the internet economy. It only focuses on the ISPs, the companies that you contract with to actually gain internet access. It doesn't at all affect companies that are sometimes called edge companies. They're not internet providers. They're the internet content that you consume over the internet, like Facebook, like Twitter, like Snapchat, like Instagram, social networking sites and sharing sites and things like that. Those are, as you said, the very companies that gather our personal information. Those are the very companies that target marketing at us. Those are the very companies that sometimes engage in what looks like speech discrimination or viewpoint discrimination. Those are the companies that seem to be engaging in the controversial behavior, and those companies are not touched by this regulation. This regulation focuses exclusively and unnecessarily on the internet providers and perhaps does not focus enough on the very companies that are in a position to do harm to consumers.
1-800-351-1212. 800-351-1212 if you want to talk to Tom Giovanetti. Tom, let's change gears. Let's go from internet regulation to internet taxes. We've been talking about this internet tax issue for some years now. Many times if you go on the website and you buy something, if you're buying something off the web from an organization that's not in your state, you don't have to pay sales tax. States have not liked that and have been pushing for some time to make sure that that they are able to collect that sales tax even if we're buying it from somebody who is in a different state. What's the status of the internet sales tax debate right now?
Well, very much like the net neutrality issue, this is another issue that's been around for about 20 years, ever since e-commerce started. It was a more severe issue back then than it is now, because these days a lot of the companies that we buy products from over the internet, they go ahead and charge sales taxes because they have what's called a physical presence in your state. There's an exact parallel between buying something over the internet and back in the old days when we used to buy things from mail order catalogs. You remember buying things from mail order catalogs, whether it was a Sears catalog or Land's End or whatever it was? We used to get these catalogs, these wish books. We would flip through them. We would call up on the phone and buy things, or we would send in order forms. And you didn't have to pay sales taxes on those transactions by and large because those orders were being fulfilled by a company that was not in your same state. And the states didn't like this, so the states sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in what was called the Quill decision, the Supreme Court found that unless a company has a physical presence in your state, they cannot compel you to pay sales taxes. And this turns out to be a really important principle. This is related to federalism, and it's related to the idea of taxation without representation.
Mm-hmm.
States love to be able to tax people who don't get to vote in that state. States love to have low taxes on their voters, but then charge high taxes on people from outside their state who don't actually get to vote. So it's not just a technical issue. There's some actually really important issues involved. So the states lost that fight when it came to mail order catalog sales. Now they're trying to have exactly the same fight with relationship to internet sales. And about 3 weeks ago, the Supreme Court heard those arguments, and sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to find out what the Supreme Court's answer is.
Well, it'll be interesting. Let's go to Robert. He has a question about regulation. Robert, you're on the line with Tom Giovanetti.
Thank you for taking my call. Under the Obama administration, they had passed something in regards to the internet for providing internet for everyone in rural areas. And I'm wondering if this isn't a cause and effect attempt by the providers, the internet providers. In other words, they want the cost to go up so that something down the road will be provided for government funding to provide the internet. And this is what I'm talking about in regards to the G5 network, because in order for the G5 network, not only Wi-Fi and cell phone service to be provided, of thousands and thousands of new cell towers, microwave towers will be set up in metropolitan areas, and a system of low-flying satellites beaming down internet will be implemented as well for the G5 network. And I was wondering if they're looking to provide a mechanism for funding, such as in the infrastructure bill.
Good question.
It's a good question. There's actually a couple of different sort of not necessarily related issues in there. But what the caller is calling the G5 network is 5G is the technical term for it. And what 5G is simply the next high-speed version of wireless. So if you've got a fairly recent phone right now, you have what's called an LTE phone, and LTE is the fastest wireless technology that we have today. Well, there's a much faster new generation of wireless available, and it's called 5G. But 5G requires a lot more smaller antennas to be scattered around. So right now you may be getting a signal to your cell phone from a cell phone tower that's 5 miles away. 5G doesn't travel that far. It's faster, but it's shorter. And so to have a 5G network, we will have to have these little shoebox-size antennas all over the place. I mean, just about on every office building, on a lot of telephone poles and that sort of a thing. So that's how that technology works, and the private companies are more than happy to make that investment in 5G so long as they're not going to be heavily regulated, which will take some of the profit away. Now, what happened under the Obama administration is they did, in fact, spend a lot of money on broadband grants, and the idea was to take broadband out to areas that were unserved. And, you know, I don't really have a problem if there's areas that private enterprise has decided they can't or won't serve for whatever reason. I don't really have a problem with the government entering into local partnerships to try to build out internet service in that area. What I object to is the government actually trying to compete with the private sector and build government or taxpayer-supported networks where there's already a private network. If you believe in limited government, if you believe in limited constitutional government, you do not want the government competing with the private sector. If there's something that the private sector can do or is doing, you don't want the government coming in and driving the private sector out. So to me, the provision of Internet services is a perfect example of something that the private sector does and does well, and that I don't want the government doing. Because in those few rare places where governments actually do run communications networks like this, we have seen people have their speech discriminated against. We have seen people blocked from government networks. Government is not who you want to trust with the provision of that kind of service.
Great question. We'll be back with Linda in just a minute.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Our national motto has appeared on our paper currency since the 1950s, our coins since the 1860s, and was first articulated as our motto by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. Recently in Ohio, a group of atheists filed a lawsuit against the United States Congress, the Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Mint, the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and, for good measure, the United States of America, in a failed bid to invalidate the national motto from our currency. First Liberty Institute represented the American Legion in a friend of the court brief urging the court to dismiss the challenge to the motto. Thankfully, the court has joined 11 circuit courts of appeal and the Supreme Court of the United States in rejecting constitutional challenges to our national motto. If a court were ever to invalidate the national motto, "In God We Trust" would have to be scrubbed from the walls of Congress, erased from our currency, deleted as the state motto of Florida, cut off with the flag of Georgia, ripped off the backs of sheriff's cruisers nationwide, and bleeped during the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Not only would that come at an enormous cost to accomplish, it would come at a detrimental cost to our history and heritage as a people. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. We're in our last segment with Tom Giovanetti with the Institute for Policy Innovation. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. We've been talking about Internet regulation and taxes, and Tom, Linda has a question. So let's go to Linda. Linda, you're on the air.
Hi. Actually, I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Mm-hmm.
The gentleman speaking said that the companies, without regulation from the government, innovate and give us new services. And I think he said that they have given us like the same services and the costs have actually gone down. And that is totally opposite of what our experience has been, and almost anybody who takes cable will tell you the prices just keep going up and up. My prices have probably more than doubled in the last couple years, and we take the minimum packages, and if you call the company, they just say, well, if you will bundle, then, we'll actually charge you more, but we'll give you more services. And I don't want more services. I just want, what I've got, but I'd like to not be charged so much.
It's an interesting question, Linda, because at least from my standpoint, my cable bill, internet bill, has stayed the same or gone down. My phone bill for the landline stayed the same or gone down, and they've given me more service. It's the cable television that seems to be going up in prices. At least that's my experience. Tom, how do you respond to Linda?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with Linda at all, and I was careful to say in some cases the price has gone down. What has happened over the course of time is that what the cable company is offering you has continually changed. And as I think you pointed out, a lot of times it's the cost of phone service and the cost of internet has gone down, but it's the cost of programming that has gone up. So it's actually the video part, it's actually the TV part of cable that has continually become more expensive because the TV channels and the production places that sell them content charges the cable company more for that content. Now, here's what's interesting is that it is more possible today than ever before to, quote-unquote, cut the cord with the cable company and actually, with some online streaming or with a high-def antenna in your house, actually cobble together a nice bit of content for free or for a very low cost. The cable companies are quite vulnerable and quite concerned these days about cutting the cord. And unless you're a hardcore sports fan, unless you just have to have ESPN and some of the sports stations, you can actually get by quite well without a subscription to cable. And one of these days, ESPN is going to start streaming all of their content online with their own streaming service, and that is going to really shake up the cable industry. So I'm not saying that the cost of cable video has not gone up, because it absolutely has. But one of the great things that an innovative free market does is it does constantly offer consumers new products and services. And today, as I said, you can stream a lot of content over the internet much cheaper than you can get it through a cable provider.
Tom, do you expect 5G to increase the price significantly?
Well, what 5G is going to do is it's going to make a lot of things possible today that are not quite possible. For instance, a lot of the discussion about smart cars, autonomous cars, and things like that are going to be enabled by 5G. Better GPS navigation because the GPS system will be able to much more precisely locate where you're standing or where your car is. Those sorts of things are the things that are going to be enabled by 5G, as well as faster streaming. Now, personally, I cannot imagine trying to watch a movie or a TV show over a phone, but there are a lot of people out there who do it. And, under 5G, they're going to have much faster streaming speed. So if you're the kind of person who doesn't mind watching a movie or a TV show on a 3-inch screen, you'll be able to better do that under a 5G network.
Let's take the last few minutes here to talk a bit about the future of the Internet. You've got the Internet of Things, in which things in our house are all connected to the Internet. Where do you see this going?
Well, it's anybody who says that they can predict where things are going is almost always wrong. The big prediction for the last few years has been the Internet of Things, like you said, where virtually everything in your house is connected to the Internet, light bulbs and your refrigerator and everything. But we're starting to see the downside of the Internet of Things, because some of the hacking that's actually going on these days is actually going on some of those Internet-connected devices. And while you might be careful to always update your antivirus software on your laptop or on your home desktop computer, how do you update the antivirus protection of your smart light bulb or your smart refrigerator? It's actually much harder to do. So, with every new exciting thing that comes along, there's always a downside. I think more and more e-commerce is going to move to the Internet. I think people are going to more and more trust doing their banking over the Internet. I think with some of the digital currencies that are coming along, you're going to be able to do a shocking amount of your financial life from a phone, walking down the sidewalk, not just buying and selling things, but moving your investments around and using digital currencies to do that. But the exciting thing about the Internet and the sometimes scary thing about the Internet is we never really know what the next big thing is going to be. It's actually been a while since we've had a next big thing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
But as you say, that seems to make us more vulnerable, at least our information and data and so forth, and we're seeing examples of that almost on a daily basis.
No, it's absolutely true, and it's still true to this day that if you want something to be absolutely secure, you make sure it's physical and not digital, and you put it in a place that is not connected to anything. You know, if you're a computer security professional, a lot of times they work on machines that are purposely not connected to the Internet. They make sure that there's what's called an air gap between their machine and the Internet. That's the only way to be absolutely secure. There's going to be constant cybersecurity warfare in trying to keep ahead of people who are trying to do us harm over the Internet. You know, human nature being what it is, every good thing that comes along, there's always going to be people out there who try to use it for harm and to use it to harm people. So it's just the same old thing at a faster pace and a higher level of intensity.
And in the last minute or so, should we be concerned about government regulation over the Internet? Does that give government access to our information and the ability to be able to use it against us?
Well, I'm very much a skeptic of government. I believe in limited government. I don't believe there's such a thing as good government. I think the best we can do is limited government. And that's why I think tools like encryption are very valuable and important things. I don't think putting the government in charge of our communications infrastructure is a good thing. I think that probably can only accrue to our harm. Right now we have, it seems to be the best of both worlds. We have an Internet and an e-commerce ecosystem that is almost entirely free market and private sector. And I think that's why there's been so much creativity and so much innovation that has happened in the Internet sector over the past decade or so. To the degree that the government gets more involved in it, to the degree that the government exercises more regulation on it, my personal opinion is that can only cause harm.
And we've seen the example of that in some cases. You know, the government oftentimes is the one that can't seem to protect the information. They're hacking into the Social Security Administration and other government websites.
It's absolutely true. Some of the worst cybersecurity intrusions have been into government agencies that were not even meeting the minimum security requirements on government computers and government servers.
We've been talking to Tom Giovanetti, president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, about Internet regulation, Internet taxes, and what's going to be happening there. When we come back, we'll be discussing missions, the history of missions, what's happening in missions these days, countries that have major challenges and so forth. So stay with us, and we will be back in just a few minutes.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And I have been looking forward to this program for a little while because we're going to discuss the issue of missions. A few things are part of Christianity more than missions. The command for us to go out and share our faith, not just with those right around us, but with those in our nation and around the world. It has been part of the Christian mission since the beginning. So we want to talk a little bit about that, about what's happening in missions, how that came about, what we're doing now, some of the challenges out there. Joining us is Kurt Nelson. He is CEO of East West Ministries. Kurt, you've been with East West for quite a while now, haven't you? What, 20-something years?
22 years.
22 years, and you weren't always CEO of it. You were involved, and then, 15 years ago?
8 years ago. Stepped into that role.
Stepped into the role of that. We're going to talk a little bit about what East West does. And Mike Shear with Denton Bible Church. He is he manages the mission program at the church. So we're talking both about a sort of a parachurch organization and the church organization there. Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, tell us, Kurt, let's start off talking a little bit about what East West does, how long it's been around, and what your object is.
Our object is to multiply followers of Jesus in the spiritually darkest areas of the world. So we're intentionally taking on the hardest, most unreached places in the world. What was your other question?
Tell us about the size of the organization.
We have about...
You've been around how long?
I've been with East West 22 years, in full-time missions 27 years. And I really like to use the phrase paired with the church instead of parachurch as far as we're concerned, because without the local church, there is no East West Ministries. So everything we do on this side of the ocean and overseas is all paired with local believers in local churches and a real partnership together in trying to make disciples of Jesus Christ in the least reached parts of the world.
Now, you exist by donation strictly, or?
Strictly by donation. That's individuals, churches, and foundations all together.
And how many missionaries do you have?
We have approximately 250 full-time missionaries, approximately 300 full-time staff altogether. That would be on the North American side. And then several thousand foreign indigenous national workers in 47 of these spiritually dark nations.
A very large organization working on that. Now, Mike, Denton Bible Church has taken on the effort to try to send missionaries out. Tell us what do you see as the role of the church in sponsoring missionaries? Because a lot of churches out there you never really get involved with that. Personally, they may give money to an organization or to their denomination that does that, but Denton Bible Church actually does this directly.
That's right. In fact, the founding pastor of our church, a man named Mel Summerall, years ago, was a visionary for missions, always had a heart for it. And he asked the question, what role can one local church have in worldwide missions? Said, we as a church, we can't feed the world, we can't evangelize the world, but we're located near a solid seminary. We're a teaching church. We had a lot of young people. And so years ago, our church decided that we were going to try to raise up and send our own missionaries. And the real focus of those missionaries is to go out and to train other local church leaders. And so we view ourselves, we're a local church that comes alongside local church. I appreciate what Kurt said. that you guys pair with the local church. We value the local church, so we try to come alongside the local church wherever we're serving around the world for the purpose really of mentoring and modeling godly Christian leadership. We believe that really the strength of any local church is going to rest humanly on the equipping and the godliness of the leadership of that church.
Now, the role of missions for the Christian really isn't an option. It's actually a command that we got from the Lord. Can you, Kurt, get us, how did we get going into missions initially?
Well, Jesus started it all. And what's interesting is he started it all in what we call the Great Commission. I didn't realize this till several years ago. There are actually 5 Great Commission statements, one in Matthew, one in Mark, one in Luke, one in John, and one in the book of Acts. And so 5 times in the last 40 days on earth, so it was post-resurrection, pre-ascension, Jesus gave these 5 sort of last will and testaments to his disciples to go and make disciples of all the nations.
And Mike, the church actually begins to be the founding sort of missionary sending group, right? I mean, you have issues of the apostles, disciples starting to go out and engage in missions, and it seems like the church then begins to send people out. What does that early missionary effort look like?
Well, I think in the New Testament we see Paul go on 3 missionary journeys, but in addition to that, we see Philip, that he is along the road, he's sharing the gospel. The first missions in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 11, verse 19. It talks about that after the stoning of Stephen, that the believers scattered from Jerusalem. Up to that point, really, Christianity simply was a localized Jewish religion in Jerusalem. But after the stoning of Stephen, it says in verse 19 that there was geographical dispersion, that the Jewish Christians went all throughout the near Middle East. But they only spoke to Jews. In verse 20, Acts 11:20, it says, "But some went out from Antioch, and they spoke to Greeks also." And so we see the church, the local church at Antioch, was the first to really practice missions that crosses culture.
Kurt, when we get to the post-apostolic age, the church has now been established. You have churches around. Do we have evidence, do we have information to imply that they were involved in missions then, even in those early 200, 300, 400 centuries after the Great Commission?
Yes, we do. One of the things that we forget in this modern era is that the early church exploded in homes. So what we call house churches was the normal church for the first few hundred years of early Christianity. And that explosive movement that started in Acts 9, it's interesting that by the year 300, 25% of the world's population were identified as Christians, and only 50 years later, by 350, over 50% of the world's population identified themselves as followers of Jesus Christ. It was an explosive movement, but largely meeting in individual homes and residences.
Mike, we eventually, you essentially come down to the Catholic Church by the time you get to the Middle Ages, and yet they were involved in missions in various ways, were they not? Especially with the monastery movement. I mean, did the Catholic Church engage heavily in missions like we think of it today?
Well, I think if you look at church history, there was a period where the Catholic Church was slow to move into missions. But seeing the success that other denominations were having, there was a movement within the Catholic Church itself to do missions. That's where you see St. Francis of Assisi, some of those names, some of those orders arose out of either Catholic monks who would pull away from culture, but then there were others that would go to culture to seek to redeem it.
And Kurt, when we get to the modern time, the Reformation starts, and shortly thereafter we get some interest in what we call the modern missions movement. When we come back, we're going to look at the modern missions movement. What is the state of missions today? Are we expanding? Are we contracting? What's happening with missions as we look at it today? And we'll be back with Kurt Nelson and Mike Shear in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Over the last few weeks, I have read editorials and heard comments that have used the phrase educational fraud. The reason is simple. We are spending more and more money on public education and have less and less to show for it. Last month was the release of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Many people call it the nation's report card. It is not a report card you would want to show to your parents. It isn't something American taxpayers want to see either. About a third of the nation's 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. Only 1/4 were proficient or better in math. We spend all of this time and money and still have a majority of students who cannot read or compute at their grade level. Dr. Walter Williams is a columnist and economist at George Mason University. Because he is African American, he also focuses some of his attention on black students. Sadly, they did even worse in these tests, 17% proficient in reading and 7% proficient in math. He asked an important question. Why are we giving these kids diplomas? The national high school graduation rate is over 80%. That means 2/3 of these graduates cannot read at the 12th grade level, and 3/4 cannot compute at the 12th grade level. Not only is there fraud in high school diplomas, but also fraud continues when we look at the percentage of these students who go on to college. According to government statistics, about 70% of white high school graduates were enrolled in college, and 58% of black high school students were enrolled in college. This is also educational fraud, since so many of them are hardly college ready if they cannot read even at the high school level. Perhaps you can now see why so many of us are frustrated by what has become rampant educational fraud. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we're talking about missions this hour. With me, Kurt Nelson of East West Ministries, Mike Shear of Denton Bible Church. If you want to know more information about that, go to the pointofview.net website. We have information up there on that about the organizations. Kurt, we where are missions today? I mean, we started we talked about the history of missions. The modern mission movement started in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Mission movements as we sort of think of it today.
Right. So the more modern movements really started with William Carey and his focusing on the coastlands.
A Baptist.
Yeah, and focusing on the coastlands, kind of like the Marines. And then we think of Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission that began to focus on the interiors. And now in our lifetime, in about the 1970s, Ralph Winter coined the whole idea of unreached people groups and drew our attention to what we call the ethnos. There's 17,000 unique what am I trying to say, Mike? Ethno-linguistic groups. They're ethnicities, and they have a unique language. There's 17,000 of those around the world. And Ralph Winter started realizing how many of those had never had a gospel presentation to reach into those groups. And so then more recently, really in the last 10 years or so, a lot of finish the task movements are going on. There's a real conviction that today we have the technology, we have the resources, we have everything we need to be able to finish the task in our lifetime. The church has been talking about that for 2,000 years, and Jesus left that anticipation. But there's a strong conviction now that we really can finish the task of evangelizing the entire world in our lifetime.
Mike, do you think are we close to being able to reach people in the world? I mean, there may be some segments here, but are we essentially able to reach the world now, you think?
Well, I think our ability to reach the world with the message of the gospel is increasing, but I think the ability to finish the task, as Kurt is talking about, is still pretty elusive to us. That you had asked the question right before the break, is missions thriving or is it declining? Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, I'd be interested in yours, Kurt. I mean, my perspective is it's both. That the world is missions is getting more challenging. World events is making missions harder. It's less desirable sometimes for Americans to go. Mm-hmm. World leaders are becoming more antagonistic to the gospel. We've seen, I won't mention countries' names, but I can think of a handful of countries in the last year that have gotten better at finding out who the missionaries are and kicking people out. We've had people from our church removed from countries mm-hmm. in recent days, and countries are restricting access. And so I think it's becoming more challenging, but God always keeps a remnant. God always calls a remnant. And so even in the last week at just my one local church, I've talked to a widower who has said he wants to spend his remaining days overseas. Talked to a young family, husband with two kids, wife and two kids. They want to go. Mm-hmm. And we've got a couple of singles, and that's just in the last week. And so it's thriving in the sense that God continues to raise up people to go. But the challenges, in my mind, seem to be growing as well.
You know, you mentioned William Carey. He's, of course, English. And so when we're talking about missions, it seems like we were talking, at least years ago, about the English, and for now probably 200 years, the U.S. being. Are there other countries that are sending out evangelical missionaries? I mean, is there other countries that are engaged in this as we are?
So a couple of the shifts that are going on, and I would agree, Mike, that I think we're gaining and we're losing kind of at the same time. The global population growth is outgrowing the conversion growth of Christianity globally, and so that's a huge challenge. We've got to catch up with and then bypass just population growth. Some of the changes, though, are also that churches, the role of the local church and the role of the parachurch is morphing, and we're having to learn to work together better. There's also a big shift to your question from the North American church to the global South and the global East. So one example would be South Korea. South Korea, the Philippines, those are two great sending countries today that will probably in short order surpass the United States in terms of sending out missionaries.
South Korea and the Philippines.
Right.
And they're identifying places they feel like there's a need, and they're sending them to those, just like we have been doing from the U.S.
Absolutely. There's something called the Back to Jerusalem movement, and the sense is that the gospel started in Jerusalem, and then it made its way west, and now it's making its way back around the globe and coming back through the east and back to Jerusalem. And so there are Chinese missionaries, Filipino missionaries, South Korean missionaries that are all trying to finish the task of this yet unreached part of the globe, hearing the gospel.
Where are some of the more difficult spots out there? Which are some of the more challenging countries?
You know, I tend to think of them in three categories. And so you have countries in the Middle East where the pressure is on anyone of faith. And so the restriction would be if someone finds you that because of their religious convictions, they may kill you, oppress you, or force you to leave. So the accommodation is to leave the area or to abandon your faith. Mm-hmm. There's a second area, I think, oftentimes in Asia and some places in Africa as well, where the pressure is coming from the government. And so they may not necessarily seek to kill you, but there is persecution. You can lose jobs. You can lose status in your communities. And they can limit access. And so that's what the restriction is. And so the accommodation is you grow quiet in your faith. Mm-hmm. I'm much more hesitant to share my faith with others because it's going to impact me or my family. And then the third place where I think I see pressure on the church today is really in the Western Europe and in America, where the pressures are much different, but the pressure is to accept cultural changes that are taking place in our societies and to embrace them, not just as acceptable, but as morally right. And the restriction is that Christianity becomes very distasteful, almost considered a prejudiced way of thinking and of living. And so the accommodation, the pressure to the church is to pull back and to not take a stand. I remember talking to one Russian brother who said, when capitalism came into Russia, he said communism was a far easier enemy than capitalism has proven to be.
You know, when we think about missions, we sometimes think about people going out to rugged areas, difficult to survive in. And yet Europe at one point was heavily Christianized. They were sending out people. And yet I've seen stories, pictures and so forth, churches in Scotland that have become car washes or things. It seems like we've lost that Christian element there in much of Europe. Is it hard to go back to a place that used to be widely Christian and now not so Christian anymore? Is that a more difficult slot to be able to evangelize?
I think undoubtedly it is, and it's almost like think of an analogy of an inoculation. It's almost like they've been inoculated by Christianity in a sense that it was there for hundreds of years. So it's really lost its real fundamental meaning and significance. So you have churchianity. You don't have Christianity. You have people following traditions of churches, even evangelical or Protestant churches, as opposed to following Jesus and his mandates. This is still a very fruitful time for the gospel. And even though we may be falling behind population growth, we've never seen more fruitfulness globally for the gospel. More Muslims have come to Christ in the 21st century than ever since Islam began. And so we're seeing these great movements among Hindus, among Muslims, among Buddhists, among animists, among communists, all around the world, of people coming to Christ still.
Mike, you mentioned somebody who says he wants to go out to be a missionary, but he's older now, is he not? Or
yes.
So is becoming a missionary a commitment I make for life? Or can I do this for a year or two? Can I do it? Do you have missionary trips where people go out for a couple of weeks and just go and involve themselves in missions and then come back?
Yes, in fact, we do all the above. And so at our church, we have a process where we try to have a season of information where we let people know about missions. And oftentimes the first step into the missions world is through a short-term trip. 1 week, 2 week trip. I know, Kurt, you guys do a lot of those. We do a lot of them as a local church. And I would say 90% of the career missionaries I know first received a calling or a passion from those short-term trips. But then we'll send people out. We'll ask for a 4-year commitment if you're going to go longer term, because it's going to take you 2.5 years to learn language and culture. And then after that, we just ask you stay until God calls you away. God called you here, and if he wants you to leave, he'll call you away. And so we've had missionaries go out for a few years, and we've had some that have been out in the field now 20, 30 years.
If you want to talk to Kurt Nelson or Mike Shear about missions, 1-800-351-1212 is the number. 1-800-351-1212. In the next segment, we want to get into some of those countries that are engaged in persecution of pastors and other elements of Christianity. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. We're talking about missions today with Kurt West of East West Ministries and Mike Shear of Denton Bible Church. If you'd like to talk to them about, have a question about missions, 1-800-351-1212 is the call-in line. 1-800-351-1212. Mike, we closed off the last segment talking a little bit about short-term missions, and I've heard churches do this. They sometimes say, we're going to go out and do something in Mexico or someplace like that for a couple of weeks, work on missions, maybe help people out and so forth. So, but that's probably not going to be the real challenging countries, I assume. And what's involved in these short-term missions?
Well, a short-term missions experience is more than just the week you're on the mission field. It's really a season of life where you get to see God do things, from making the decision to go, to raising the support, to talking to friends and neighbors and having the opportunity to share the gospel even with them, to explain why you would pick up and use vacation time to go overseas. But the time overseas is oftentimes varied. And as a local church, we have about 80 missionaries in the mission field. And about half those are out with other agencies. In fact, we have 2 missionaries, families that are out with Kurt with East West Ministries. And then there's about half of those missionaries we send out. We're both the sending church and the sending agency. And so they're employees of our church. And when we put together short-term trips, we send them to our people. And so we know that the people that are going out for a 2-week experience are oftentimes sharing the gospel. They're doing vacation Bible schools. They're working with kids. They're doing things they would normally do here, but they have the opportunity to see God expand their horizons and do that overseas. And oftentimes those would be places where it's fairly easy for Americans to travel, but we do send teams into more difficult places. And so as a church, we'll be selective on who we'll send on certain trips, but we'll send people really anywhere God opens the door.
Kurt, I've talked to one of your board members, because not everybody can can become a missionary or spend a lot of time, but they sometimes have a few weeks or a month or something they can give. And one of your board members told me how it was a life-changing experience for him to do that. Now, you have missionaries going out that are full-time missionaries, but I think you also do some shorter-term mission events. Is that right?
We do. We will take approximately 1,200 people this year on 8 to 10-day mission trips throughout the world. We also do some 2-month summer internship-type mission trips. Have several of those going out this summer. And then we have 1 to 2 year teaching English in, I won't name country names for security reasons, but in some Asian countries we're teaching English. And so all a person has to have is a college degree and 1 year of work experience, and they can go for 1 to 2 years and teach English to students who are very anxious to know about American culture and American religious history, and a great opportunity they're looking for Bibles, they're looking to understand just our faith perspective, and great opportunities and openness for the gospel. And then as Denton, we also have longer 4-year and longer terms as well.
Now, if I'm going to do that, one of the short-term missions, do I cover all the expenses myself if I'm going to do that?
Yes. What we encourage most people to do is actually to raise their own support, even on a 1 week or 10-day mission trip. Those are typically somewhere $2,500 to $3,000, depending where you're going in the world, maybe $3,500. But even those that can afford to write a check and pay their own way, we encourage them to raise support. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so we want them to have a team of prayer supporters that are supporting them financially and praying for them as they go and serve.
Mike, we've seen some of the countries, I think Iran here recently, that they've been locking up pastors. Is this a threat, a challenge for missionaries as well in some countries, that they might very well find themselves in jail if they cross a line?
I think it's an increasing threat, especially for American missionaries. In the past, an American passport usually meant you would not be arrested. You would just be kicked out of the country. The real threat was to the national pastors. But in recent years, we have had even folks from our church. We've had some people apprehended, kicked out of the country. and aware of just in the last couple of weeks where there have been some apprehensions of American missionaries, and they've been detained for an extended period.
Kurt, you mentioned that in some cases it's things like teaching language. In some cases, they're going out to do, there may be a mission element, but they may be doing something like medical care or teaching language or something like that.
We're partnering with one organization we love called Teach to Transform, and that is a medical mission where we're training really indigenous workers, Christian workers, to be sort of like village medics.
Mm-hmm.
And our staff are training these workers, and they're able to get into what we call restricted access, or what we used to call closed countries, but now they're creative access or restricted access, and get in and share the gospel where North Americans might not be able to get there. We're also doing what we call business, it's known as businesses missions, and we're finding great opportunity for Americans to get in some of these other countries where missionaries have a harder time getting in with business visas, and doing legitimate business and business training, but with believers who, again, want to reach further into their own peoples with the gospel.
If I go in as a medical missionary, let's say, am I going to set up a separate church, something in my house? Am I going to find somebody, or am I just going to sort of stay away from that and just rely on myself or my family members to share the gospel?
So our North Americans that go on these short-term teams do share the gospel. We typically have an interpreter and then a local church guide who helps get us connected into their village, town, community. But we're also constantly equipping the local national workers who are going to be there long after we've returned home so that they can be effective at sharing the gospel as well. And so some of that is there's an acronym, Model, Assist, Watch, and Leave, MAWL. So we go in and we model effective evangelism. We assist them in doing it. They watch us do it, and then we leave, and they continue to share their faith with bold witness.
1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212 if you want to talk to Kurt West or Mike Shear about missions. And Kurt, the issue of, do I need this training to go in? If I go in and share, something ends up happening to me. Does the State Department come in and try to help us out? Do they say, you should have known better, you shouldn't be doing that there because it's a challenging country? What happens there?
Well, we do security training before we deploy long-term workers and even our short-term and mid-term workers. The level of the training rises with the intensity of the risk. We recently hired a security director for East West. And just so you know the caliber of this person, former Secret Service officer, used to work at the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan. So we take security very, very seriously. I don't know that I would rely on the State Department. We would reach out to them and see if they could help us. But we have a number of different protocols and a number of different resources that we will tap into to protect our people in the case of risk like you described.
Mike, years ago, Christians didn't have a lot of impact on the politics of the country. We just sort of stayed in the U.S. You just sort of stayed out of it. Most people who ran for office claimed to be Christian, and you just stayed out of that. But since Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Pat Robertson, and others, there's been an increasing role of Christians in the U.S. being involved in the political debate. What does a missionary going into another country, do they just stay completely out of that political debate? Do they get involved in it, or what happens there?
I think it's a good question. I think a lot of it depends on what purpose the missionary is going out to perform. What's their role? So many of the missionaries we send out, we're training church leaders. So we're working with pastors, elders, women's leaders. We would not get involved in politics. We would hope that there would be believers in those churches that would do so, but that wouldn't be our purpose. I know other organizations that working in the political and the military and police networks within organizations, that's what they exist to do. And so a lot of groups that work with international justice, trafficking of people, will not only try to rescue individuals from a trafficking situation, but will actually help governments write laws, will help lawyers work through the legal system so that the laws are applied properly to protect Christians. And so Really, it depends on what that missionary. We use the word missionary like it means one thing, but it's a very broad term that really covers a whole host of people that go out just for the sake of the gospel and use their gifts, their skills, their training to benefit Christ.
One of the things I mentioned earlier, in some cases, churches don't send out missionaries themselves. They send it out through their denomination.
Right.
And in some cases, as in Denton Bible Church, you send out church missionaries yourself. Do you have a sense as to how many churches actually sponsor missionaries out there as opposed to just doing it through their denomination? Is there any kind of guesstimate on that?
I don't know any specific numbers. I will tell you it's growing. When we first began, we couldn't find anyone else who was doing it. But now we know several churches that, like us, are sending their own people.
Good. We'll be back in just a minute.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Our national motto has appeared on our paper currency since the 1950s, our coins since the 1860s, and was first articulated as our motto by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. Recently in Ohio, a group of atheists filed a lawsuit against the United States Congress, the Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Mint, the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and, for good measure, the United States of America, in a failed bid to invalidate the national motto from our currency. First Liberty Institute represented the American Legion in a friend of the court brief urging the court to dismiss the challenge to the motto. Thankfully, the court has joined 11 circuit courts of appeal and the Supreme Court of the United States in rejecting constitutional challenges to our national motto. If a court were ever to invalidate the national motto, "In God We Trust" would have to be scrubbed from the walls of Congress, erased from our currency, deleted as the state motto of Florida, cut off with the flag of Georgia, ripped off the backs of sheriff's cruisers nationwide, and bleeped during the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Not only would that come at an enormous cost to accomplish, it would come at a detrimental cost to our history and heritage as a people. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our final segment on Point of View today. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. We're talking about missions with Kurt Nelson of East West Ministries, Mike Shear of Denton Bible Church, and we've been all the information about them. If you want to know more about East West Ministries, their website is on our website at pointofview.net. You can go there, find out about Kurt and find out about them, and contact them if you have any interest in finding out more about what it takes to be a missionary, how you might get involved with them and support them. And also Denton Bible Church, Mike Shear, their website is on pointofview.net. You can go there. If you have questions and you want to know about how do we set up a mission program in our church, how do we try to start sponsoring people, how do we raise money for that, they are available for you, and you can contact them, and they'll be glad to try to help you. We wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening out there in some of the more difficult areas. And, you know, Kurt, we've heard in years past that the church can often not just decline, but actually survive and thrive in persecution. And we've got countries out there where there's persecution going on, and my understanding is the church is actually doing okay in that. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, and I would even say thriving. One of the church fathers named Tertullian said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And I think we've seen that over 2,000 years of history. Two examples would be, one would be Nepal. Severe persecution of Christians going on in the kingdom of Nepal, and yet Christianity is growing twice as fast there as it is globally. Another one would be Iran. Again, severe persecution toward Christians in Iran, and yet a massive movement of people coming to Christ in the underground churches in Iran.
Mike, are you seeing something similar?
Yes, we're seeing it in countries where we used to have easy access in the past. That access is growing more and more restricted. We're seeing persecution from governments. We're seeing persecutions from other religions. And we're seeing persecution from just bands of people that would see, for instance, Christianity as anti-whatever country they're from. And so they would gather to fight against it.
Kurt, are you optimistic about where missions are right now? And especially because we're seeing among a number of countries that used to be at least a little more democratic, Turkey being one of them, things being clamped down some. Are you optimistic about what's going to be happening given this what looks like some increasing oppression out there?
I'm only optimistic because Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith, and Jesus is the author and finisher of his mission. In Matthew 24:14, it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to all the earth, and then the end will come." So Jesus spoke of the completion of his mission before his second coming. So I'm optimistic for that reason. The other reason is that Christians who live and work in these persecuted areas are making decisions every day to count the cost and to pay the price for taking risks for boldness to proclaim Jesus Christ. And I think that's part of what it's going to take is all of us calculating the risk and taking the risk that Christ called us to follow him, taking up our cross, denying ourselves, and following him no matter what the cost.
Mike, if I came to you and said, I think I'm interested in being a missionary, what would be your counsel to try to, number one, gauge whether or not that interest is real and whether or not I'm prepared to make that quest?
Well, I'd want to know a little bit about why you feel that call, and I would just ask you to explain where it is you feel called to, what is it you're called to do. Then we would talk through just your readiness, and so that would be things like biblical theological training. That would also include language, culture, any time you've spent overseas. And so we would spend some time getting to know you and walking through different aspects of training that are required to go to the field.
And if I came up and said, I'm married, my wife is not as sure about my calling as I am, what would be your counsel there?
Well, you know, I'd say there's never a perfect time to go in the mission field. Some people say, should I do it as a single? Should I do it when I've got kids? Should I do it later? There's no perfect time. Missions, by definition, require sacrifice. And so it's always going to be somewhat inconvenient. But if a wife or a husband, if a spouse is not interested in going, we as a church would not send them. That this is not something a wife says, I can be submissive and I'll follow along, because it's all of life. You give up family, you give up friends, you give up dreams, and you're moving to a culture where you know no one and nothing. And so we as a church require both the husband and the wife to be called into missions. Did y'all do a similar thing?
Yeah, we would say the same thing. I say God speaks in stereo, and so God's got to speak to the husband and the wife, or we assume he hasn't spoken clearly.
And if I come and I've got a wife and children, Are there countries you would say, if you're bringing children in there, you really shouldn't be going into this country because of some of the challenges that are there? If it's you or you and a wife, fine, but maybe you shouldn't be taking your kids in there.
Absolutely. We would assess the risk to the family in the context. We have a widower lady who serves in a relatively closed country, and she and her local church pastor have said she can stay there no matter what. So she's willing to live there and suffer there and die there. And so we're okay with that because she's okay with that, and her local church pastor back in the U.S., they all support her in that calling. We wouldn't have the same feeling if there were young children involved or an entire nuclear family involved.
Mike, if I go into a new country and is the goal for me to establish a functioning church among the locals, and then if I do that, sort of move on to something else? Or is the goal for me to be there and oversee that for some time?
We believe in our mission that the best person to do long-term ministry in a culture is a godly, well-trained person from that culture. And so our desire is to only plant churches where there is not a national that is equipped to be able to plant and to lead a church. And so typically we would bring in missionaries alongside of leaders who are already serving. We would provide training. We would provide opportunities for ministry. We would walk with them and disciple them. But we would always want the national to be the pastor.
And both of you provide some type of training for pastors after the missionary leaves? I mean, if you've got a local pastor on there, that's a sort of a mission aspect also, I suppose.
Yes, we would continue on that relationship. So there's pastors we've worked with for 20-plus years. Because if you get a pastor who is godly, he's well-trained, he shares a similar ministry philosophy, that can be a rarity on the mission field. And so we would choose to work with them for as long as we can.
And Kurt, does East West do something similar?
We do. We have 4 strategies: mobilizing the church, evangelizing the lost, equipping local leaders, and then multiplying churches and disciples. And on the equipping piece, each year we do several trainings of all of our pastors, indigenous pastors all around the world.
Very interesting. Well, thank you both for joining us. Kurt Nelson from East West Ministries, Mike Shear from Denton Bible Church. If you want to know more about their ministries and what they're doing in the area of missions, you can check with East West on their website. What is your website?
It's pretty easy, www.eastwest.org.
And Mike, Denton Bible Church?
We're dentonbible.org.
It's easy to find. And if you want to go, you can go to pointofview.net. We will have that information available there for you to find out more about them. If you have questions about the mission field, about missionaries, whether or not you should be interested in that, or if you want to support their efforts, all of that is available on the Point of View website, and so we would encourage you to go there. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us. Fascinating discussion. We've got challenges ahead, but it sounds like both of you are optimistic about some of the things that are happening out there and the work that God is doing in the world. And thank you for joining us today. If you're interested, go to pointofview.net, and we'll be back with you tomorrow.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.